Good morning and welcome everyone. Welcome every one of you, and Nanjala Nyabola, thanks for being here. Welcome to Politecnico di Torino and welcome to Biennale Tecnologia. Thank you, Nanjala, for having accepted this invitation to Biennale Tecnologia. The topic of today and this year is quite nice, no? It's, we can say, achievable utopias. I think that many thoughts and many discussion can come by this topic. I would like just to introduce you briefly, also if it is really difficult, because your life is so interesting, so please accept that is a short video. I am telling to the audience. So Nanjala Nyabola is an independent writer and researcher. She's based in London and Nairobi, and her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. For her educational background, she holds a Bachelor in African Studies and Political Science from the University of Birmingham, and Master in African Studies and Enforced Migration, both from the University of Oxford, as well as a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. She has held numerous research associate positions, including with the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Overseas Development Institute, the Oxford Internet Institute, while also working as a researcher lead for several projects on human rights broadly and digital rights specifically around the world. She has been published in several academic journals, including the African Security Review and the Women's Studies Quarterly, and also writes commentary for publications like The Guardian, The Nation, Al Jazeera, the Boston Review, and many others. She is the author of, super interesting, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, 2018, right? And Traveling White Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, 2020. And lastly, in 2022, Strange and Difficult Times, Notes on a Global Pandemic. So today, the topic of today is putting the global in digital, global digital governance, and we will explore with you this terrain of global digital governance, focusing on the word global and trying to understand if this concept really incorporates a plural and shared perspective on the future. So the question is, which opportunities and which limitation we have to face now? Thank you very much. Nanjala, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm going to stand. I hope that's okay. Buongiorno a tutti. Okay, in my culture, when I say good morning, you have to say good morning back. So, good morning. Thank you. We're acknowledging each other and we're coming into this space together, so it's important to interact. I like to have interactive conversations with people because we're building together, and that is part of the process. So, I'm going to begin. I have prepared remarks. I apologize to the translator in advance because sometimes I go off script, but I'm going to do my best. Kwa majina kamili mimi naitwa Nanjala Nyabola na mimi ni mtafiti, mtetezi wa haki na mwandishi Mkenya. Nimefurahi sana kushiriki nanyi leo kuzungumzia masuala ya teknolojia ya kidijitali, na ninatumaini kwamba maoni tutakayogawa yatasisimua na kutuelimisha. Tena natumaini kwamba mahojiano yetu yatatusaidia sisi sote kutatua masuala makubwa yanayokumba jamii yetu. Hello and welcome. I wanted to begin my talk in Kiswahili because I wanted you to be uncomfortable. I know that as Italians, many of you will be familiar with the experience of trying to learn and grapple with ideas in a second or even a third language, given the way that tech today is developed and deployed around the world. But at the very least, you have a large body of knowledge and work generated in the Italian language, as well as a concerted effort at translation. In contrast, even though Kiswahili is the most widely spoken African language in the world, spoken in at least 11 countries, and most recently made an official language of the African Union, the vast majority of us who speak it are experiencing technology primarily in European languages, specifically English and French. Languages that are deeply intertwined with long histories of violence and exploitation. One of the main arguments I make in my work is that this means that for the vast majority of people in the world, we experience digital technologies in somewhat an abstract sense, removed from our social and political realities and grafted onto our self-perception and our perception of our role in the world. I argue that this is part of the obstacle to building a truly inclusive and shared digital future. That we are not building from an organic place of demand and desire, but one shaped by the economic and political interests of a handful of people whose own view of the world is narrow, inward-looking, and fundamentally short-sighted. If we want to build digital technology for the people and by the people, then we must give the people the tools that they need to develop and deploy technology that answers the most urgent questions that they define for themselves. I feel like I have to begin this talk by emphasizing that I am not a technologist. I don't know how to code, sorry. I'm not one for labels, but I think the best way to summarize what I do is that I'm a political theorist who uses digital technologies as a substrate for developing ideas about the world. I'm not interested in the technologies per se. I'm interested in the human experience of digital technologies and how it intersects with our ideas of the past, the present, and the future. To do this work, I combine academic research and public-facing writing, as well as activism and the broader work of the defense of human rights. I'm curious about what digital technologies reveal about who we are and who we tell ourselves we are, and how these two ideas come together or fall apart. Significantly, I'm not interested in telling an African story about technology. Whenever people encounter me in my work, someone with a very African name doing work that builds on African experiences, they always assume that what I'm putting forward only speaks about the African experience. If my name was John Smith and I worked out of Washington, D.C. and wrote a whole book about digital governance at the Library of Congress, no one would question if I presented that book as a book about the world. But as an African, and particularly an African speaking in Europe to Western audiences, there is always this implicit assumption that I'm bringing into the room an abstract story that doesn't add to the mainstream, but we can sort of look over as an act of benevolence. My talk here, and hopefully all the work that I've done and continue to do, deliberately pushes back against this assumption. We all have a center. We all have a position that we take when we do both academic and public work. And I want to ask you to push back against this lazy presumption that our centers must be the same in order for the work that we do to have global relevance. Africa is not the periphery to Europe's center, but a center of its own. Today we're talking about digital technology and the future, and specifically in relation to the way digital technologies should be governed. I come to you as a person who has spent the better part of the last 10 years advising governments and international organizations about this and related questions, while working alongside some of the most brilliant activists to push back against the negative outcomes we are witnessing around the world. You have no doubt heard about surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, deepfake pornography, election misinformation and disinformation, and so many other harms that have emerged from digital technologies. I've been involved in several national and multinational initiatives that are trying to address these challenges, and I always come away with the same sense of frustration. We are nibbling around the issue, and we're not getting to the heart of it. And at the heart of it, for me, is just one simple question that requires all of our participation to answer. What kind of shared digital future do we want to live in? I think this is the fundamental question, because our shared unease about the way digital technologies are developed and deployed comes from witnessing negative things that they make possible and imagining what would happen if these negative things were not addressed, given what we know about the history of human behavior. We know without vigilance, human beings have an unfortunate tendency to collapse into their baser instincts. Consider, for example, the recently reported use of artificial intelligence in the Israeli campaign against Gaza. Years of looking the other way as elaborate systems of surveillance and harm have emerged and proliferated has culminated in technology that can accurately kill targets that it has inaccurately identified, including at least 10,000 children. Campaigns like the Stop Killer Robots Coalition have been warning for years that the digital arms race was out of control, and soon we would be starting wars that we refuse to be accountable for, to our collective detriment. But in the absence of this fundamental question, what kind of shared digital future do we want to live in? The development progresses unchecked until the harm has metastasized. Do we want to live in a shared digital future where a population that is facing famine can also be on the wrong side of some of the most elaborate and dangerous military technologies that exist? Do we want a future in which war is directed by black box computing and it happens to human bodies with no real mechanisms for accountability? Do we want a world in which marginalized communities effectively live in large-scale laboratories in which data is gathered, monetized, and militarized at an alarming scale with little or no knowledge of the public? What does this look like at scale? Is this the future of warfare? Considering how much harm the world endured during the Second World War, and with the relatively rudimentary technologies that existed then, what does total warfare in the 21st century and beyond look like if this is the kind of thing that digital technology with military applications makes possible? What kind of shared digital future do we want to live in? We are constantly engaged in acts of imagination. And these acts are shaped by our experiences of the past, the present, and the future. But this should also ideally be informed by our hopes for the future. The world that we live in is as much a product of our efforts as it is of our imagination. The problem that I see is that most of the digital technologies that are developed and deployed in the world today are built and governed by people with a partial view of the past, a narrow experience of the present, and particularly small hopes for the future. We are building digital technologies with small imaginations that have a narrow view of what the future should look like. And so I think it's critical for us to open up our imaginary to include a broader view of the past, to see the world beyond our center, to listen more to more voices in the present, and to make our hopes for the future bigger and more meaningful than maximizing our capacity to make money. And this is why I keep coming back to this mantra as a reminder. And I have to say, I'm not the first person to say this. This is something that's been said by other people probably better. There are Africans in the future. You're probably thinking, what? Where does that come from? When I talk about Africans in technology and the future, I think people always assume that I'm going to offer some kind of blueprint of why if we just put more technology into everybody's hands, then some, if not all, the problems that face the continent will be resolved. So a mobile phone in every hand, balloons bringing wireless connectivity into every home, as if the lack of technology is what is causing some of the deep structural injustices we are seeing in the world today. This is a very unique flavor of something called techno-solutionism. It's a big word. Techno-solutionism is the idea that technology is somehow the savior that we've all been waiting for. The answer to every question, the solution to every problem. But if technology is the answer to every question, then does it mean that all the questions are meaningless? Look around. Does it feel as if we're living in a moment in which any, let alone many, of the world's major questions have been answered at all? Does it feel as if we are any closer to figuring it out what it means to be human, alone and in relation to others? The phrase, "there are Africans in the future," is a prompt, it's a challenge, it's a reminder. It's a demand, I think, to grapple with our concept of Africa, which is a geography that is the second largest continent in the world, with at least 1 billion people living, loving, and hoping in it, as well as a concept that is so often misused and abused in theory, in practice, that it's become almost meaningless. Africa is both a real and an unreal place. It's a real geography, but also an unreal imaginary that's been constructed primarily through lazy Western generalizations that more reflect the fears and the obsessions of those who are not of Africa than those who are. And so the idea of Africa is wielded as a weapon or a threat, particularly by politicians who want to use fear to generate consent, but also some kind of pure mythical terrain that exists to help people find themselves. Now stay with me, because I want to use this as an idea to interrogate the way we imagine digital technologies. Most of our ideas about tech and how it should develop and deployed come from within a worldview. And part of this worldview sees Africa as a problem to be solved, rather than a place where people live. Indeed, you see this as part of a longer history in which Africa is a question that has haunted Western thought. First, it was the missionary zeal to convert, then the colonial zeal to colonize and dominate, and today, this developmentalist idea to transform. All this within a specific imagination. So, how does this connect to techno-solutionism? Well, I think that there are many problems to which technology is the answer. I do. I'm short-sighted. You can't tell because I'm wearing contacts. But I love my glasses. I think comfortable shoes and indoor toilets are wonderful. Affordable medicine, absolute miracle. But I still insist that technology is not the answer to every problem. There are so many crucial questions on the path to understanding what it takes to be human that technology cannot answer, and indeed should not be directed towards. I think technology can address some of the major issues we face in the world, but for others, we need to look away from what is built to what is felt and what is experienced. And I believe keeping a clear eye on what distinguishes these two is one of the most important ways we can protect ourselves from the harms that technology can and is inflicting on society today. Look, I'm not here with some inspirational message about how Africa is going to save the world from itself. To paraphrase Aimé Césaire, Africa is not the anti-Europe or Europe's negative space in which Europeans get to project their hopes and their fears about who they are and who they want to be. Africa is just a place. It's a place made up of many diverse and interesting places. And like any other place, it's filled with ordinary people, with ordinary lives in the face of challenges and opportunities. And it's this ordinariness that I think I want us to sit with as we think about opening up our ideas about the global in relation to technology. One of the very ordinary ways in which African people challenge our current approach to our shared digital future is, again, pushing back against this idea of techno-solutionism. I've mentioned already this idea of developmentalism, or the notion that one part of the world, Europe and the West, is forward and everybody else is backward. So in relation to digital technologies, you see this in arguments like, put a mobile phone in everyone's hand. There's no choice or agency in this framework. People have to accept forward in whatever form it is provided and swallow the discomfort of any frictions that arise. Developmentalism is not about providing access to clean water or giving people much needed medicines. It's not about addressing the injustices that create obstacles to these in the first place. It's about fundamentally reorganizing people's lives and livelihoods so that they look like other people's lives, middle-class lives in other parts of the world. And I think the limits to this approach should be self-evident. There simply isn't enough stuff in the world for all of us to live middle-class Western lives. And you hear that, and I think don't hear me saying as if people's hopes and aspirations for better don't count. What I'm saying is, let's think critically. Ideally, many middle-class people in the West should have stopped living the lives that they have been living. The bane of climate change is breathing down our necks. Plastic waste is choking our oceans, and competition for what little exists is creating conflict and crisis around the world. March 2024 was the hottest March in history, just like March 2023 was the hottest one before that. March 2022 was the hottest one before that. Study after study is telling us that if Western corporations don't fundamentally shift the way people consume, the entire planet will not be able to tolerate our presence. So what does that have to do with digital technologies? Think about the mobile phone. I think about mobile phones a lot because mobile phones are often presented as the sum total of digital technologies and the experiences of Africans. Mobile phones are mostly made of plastic and metal and semiconductors. Semiconductors need coltan, and most of the world's coltan comes from the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Some researchers argue that our global demand for coltan sustains devastating wars, mining communities with systemic injustices. The amazing Congolese painter, Eddie Kamwanga Ilunga, whose work is on the cover of my first book, created this series of paintings called the Mangbetu paintings, where he thinks about what the surging demand for digital technologies has done to the lives of the Mangbetu people. We know this. We've known this for almost 2 decades. This is not news, should not be news to anybody. But how many of you, when you bought your mobile phone, were given a plan for what to do with it when you were done with it, when it was out of date? There is actually not that many mobile phone companies that offer end-of-life guarantees or mechanisms for older models. They will make your machines redundant by constantly sending you updates that you didn't ask for, but they cannot tell you what to do, what you're supposed to do with it when you're done. We are encouraged to update our phones every 2 years. But if you're putting your phone in the trash, chances are it's going to end up in landfill, it's going to end up in an e-waste trash heap in Ghana, in Malaysia, choking waterways and suffocating nature all around it. This is part of the ordinariness of digital technology that the African experience asks us to sit with. Ordinary people whose lives are being disrupted in such fundamental ways because of our inability to imagine beyond the narrow frameworks of software and hardware and our own personal use. In the West, the delusion that digital technology is an abstract thing that happens in the cloud. It doesn't use water, it doesn't generate waste, it doesn't require more and more natural resources to be dug out from the earth in increasingly perilous context to sustain. We're all driving green cars with lithium batteries. We have no idea where lithium comes from. Governments want to talk about the opportunities of expanding AI without talking about how much water is consumed by the cooling towers that make AI possible. And before resolving the challenge of dry riverbeds and forest fires emanating from the costs of climate change. Looking at this experience of digital technology, not just a magical transformation between backward and forward, but as a process that happens to real people in the real world and their communities, reminds us that tech has a materiality to it, that data belongs to the body and not to the cloud, and that digital companies, just like any other item, is built and deployed by human beings that sit on a planet that is part of our shared digital future. I have to tell you, it's changing now, but it's been very hard to have these kinds of conversations within the space of global digital governance. Many of the people who work on these issues prefer to let the people who build these systems get away with very little scrutiny because there's a lot of money to be made. And money is often framed as the main obstacle that will get us from backward to forward. It's shifted because the number of people who are in the room is shifting. It's shifted because some of these consequences that have been happening somewhere else are now coming home. Compromised elections, the collapse of labor protections, the upsurge in electronic waste, the use of digital warfare. It's no longer enough to behave as if technology is something that just happens. Our institutions are changing and showing agency. It's no longer possible to ignore that unless we work together and come up with some kind of global digital governance, we are sleepwalking into a dangerous future. So, all of which is to say, the question is not whether or not we need global digital governance. The question is who should be at the table? What voices should be heard? What should be the underlying intention behind it? And given our experiences of how one technology developed in one part of the world can have serious consequences in another, it's important that our answers to these questions live up to the concept of global. There's a pair of Canadian scholars called Kieran O'Hara and Wendy Hall who have basically summarized the space that we live in today for global digital governance. They call these 4 different approaches, and I'm going to just very quickly list them before I summarize my point. They talk about the California approach, which is this laissez-faire capitalism technologists prefer, where self-governance is done by the companies themselves. And the advantage of this model is that it allows people to build things that are interesting to them, to be in community with people who echo their own interests, but we are living with many of the disadvantages. Not least because it allows, the California approach allows private owners of various digital technologies to exploit other people's labor and production for profit. Yesterday, someone sent an email in a group that I was in and said, we want to make our AI more democratic of food systems around the world. Can you please send us pictures of food from your community? Which sounds like, fair enough, inclusive thing. Except that AI was being built for profit. So we take photos for free, and we put them on the platform for free, and give up the copyright for free, and they own a multi-million-dollar company that we don't get to share the profits in, and we don't get to share the proceeds of. How many times does this happen every day? Every time you put a picture up on your Facebook or on your Instagram, and they build an AI with your images on it, and you get nothing. The risks are all socialized, the rewards are all privatized, creating a new class of billionaire, and even trillionaire, who pretends that he, and it's always a he, is one of the people. The Washington approach is the US government's approach to techno-capitalism. Because with the exception of 1 or 2 Chinese companies, the vast majority of the largest tech companies in the world are American. This approach is stuck between the paradox of wanting to protect profits and maintain the status of the US as the global leader of digital technology, and on the other, the realization that if these companies are not reined in, the negative effects will be felt domestically as well. So the US government did not intervene when social media companies were negatively affecting elections around the world until its own elections in 2016 came under fire. In many ways, the Washington approach reflects the idiosyncrasies of the US system. It's a bipartisan consensus rather than a broader united perspective. And this is part of the reason why this model is not suited to global digital governance, because many of the social and political characteristics of the United States are unique. Think about the US definition of free speech, constitutionally protected free speech. It's a standard that would not be held anywhere else in the world. Many of us live in countries that have prohibitions that are rooted in history. The Rwandan genocide means that calling people cockroaches in Rwanda has very specific implications. In Germany, regardless of what's happening in Germany right now, there are very strict restrictions on the kind of content that can be shared that pertains to Nazism and racism. So the US standards of absolute free speech reflect the US history and US constitutionalism. And for historical reasons, they cannot and must not be applied everywhere. The Brussels approach, which is closer to home, reflects the EU's desire to be seen as the rights-driven region of the world. After years of merely taking up technology made up elsewhere, the EU now wants to play a standard-setting role in deciding how tech will be governed. We've seen legislation coming out of Brussels in the last 5 years alone. The AI Act, the Digital Services Act, not to mention GDPR, all of which have fundamentally altered the way digital companies in the world work. But the EU's approach is limited because it reinforces this fortress approach. It marches to the beat of its own drum with only marginal inclusion of other regions. And more importantly, it assumes a whole network of pre-existing rights that cannot be assumed across the region. What do the German and Hungarian approaches to freedom of expression have in common? Does the German protection of the right to free speech apply to all citizens, or only those who refuse to criticize the state of Israel? Finally, the Beijing approach is one in which the heavy hand of the state is felt at all levels of development and deployment of digital technology. Development oriented towards state objectives, and there are many efforts by the state to influence, including the so-called Great Firewall. I was recently teaching a class in which the majority of my students were from mainland China, and 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and many of them did not know that they were living behind a Great Firewall. So we were discussing it in class and talking about how there were some sites that you couldn't see in China, and I could see this sort of aha moment of, wait, that's not how the internet works. This is a model that is called the Chinese approach, but it's actually happens in a few more countries. And we've seen that it substitutes the long hand of the market with the heavy hand of the state. And these interventions have become more commonplace and more extreme, for example, with the recent ouster of Jack Ma from Alibaba. There are other related approaches, Russia, Iran, very specific approaches to the internet. But where does the rest of the world reside? What role do they play in shaping our digital future? Are we merely destined to wait until decisions are taken and then find our place within it? Or is there a way to think about a truly global digital approach, to digital governance that sees the world and not just those who have power in it? This is the question that animates my current research and feeds into my intervention today. This search for global. To me, I think it starts with imagination. And I feel like I'm giving you an insight into how my brain works, because I don't like thinking along one discipline and then put that away and think into another discipline. I think we learn from so many different sources. I think it's so critical for us to reimagine and to go back to reimagining, guided by this question: what kind of shared digital future do we want to live in? This comes from thinking critically about this developmentalist idea, this idea of forward and backward, and that the purpose of technology is to make that movement. Pushing back against this idea that let's just throw more tech at everything and everything will get solved. To reimagine, we have to look at what conditions we are assuming the question contains. I talk about developmentalism and techno-solutionism together because they usually come together. Where developmentalism answers the what question, techno-solutionism answers the how question. In Africa, this approach is particularly pernicious because, again, Africa is constantly framed as a problem, not as a real place filled with real people who are affected by the choices that people make. The missionary zeal to conquer and convert remains present in the way Europe and North America imagine their role in relation to African communities, not as partners, but as a place where problems can be solved. So, if technology is the answer to every problem, these ideas that imagine Africa as a place that has no past, no present, or no future, but merely one in which aspirations can be projected, I think is part of the reason why when we watch movies and television shows and read texts in popular culture that imagine a future in a world shaped by technology, it's so hard to imagine what Africa will be in that future, because Africa is seen as part of the problem and not the solution. Black Panther is very much an outlier, and even that I have a lot of issues with. But think about the last time you watched a science fiction movie or read a science fiction book that was trying to imagine a tech-driven future. What did Africa look like? What were Africans doing? How were they living in that future? This, to me, is the connection. Because Africa, again, not a real place with real people, but a problem that has been solved as part of that imaginary. I want to finish by talking about an author that I think bucks this trend, that I think is really important. Octavia Butler, who to me is a genius of science fiction writing, was so accurate in her imagination of how technology would improve some aspects of being human and exacerbate some of our worst instincts. Published in 1994 and set in 2023, one of her novels, The Parable of the Sower, doesn't just have Africans in it, but is also a very eerie premonition of how this quest for progress without context, for forward without equality, would exacerbate inequalities pre-existing in society today. She imagines what unchecked greed would do to our relationship with the environment, how this odd approach to progress would leave many of those who live with privilege scrambling for walls and fortresses to keep those who don't have privilege out. The book's opening sequences foreshadow much of what we're seeing in the West today. Nations or regions that sow chaos by building technology driven to improve our capacity to inflict harm through warfare, surveillance capitalism, selling that onwards, and then building walls to try and keep the chaos out. That illusion of calm that is necessary to keep those inside the walls satisfied, necessitating higher and more complicated walls and more violence to keep the consequences out. I won't spoil the book by revealing too many details, but suffice it to say, given how fortress Europe is going today, people being allowed to die on the high seas in order to make a point about borders, the trajectory of the story shouldn't come as a surprise. So, I know you're thinking, gosh, why is she talking about novels? Isn't this a talk about technology that actually exists? Again, I think it's about thinking ourselves out of this intellectual cul-de-sac. We forget that so much of what we think about science and technology is animated by imagination, by ideas shaped by our experiences and perception of the world from our unique centers. The books that we read as children and young adults are integral to what we think is or should be possible. If I did a survey of this room, I think I can guarantee that everyone can think of at least one novel, one short story that they read at some point in their life that they keep coming back to as an adult. More importantly, the world's leading technologists repeatedly tell us that many of their ideas are shaped by reading fictions. A 2023 New York Times article points out that Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, I don't know how many of you have heard of this. It's an interesting series. But in it contains the so-called 3 rules of robotics. And this book is a firm favorite amongst Silicon Valley technologists and animates many of their moral considerations about how technology should be developed. I highly encourage you to read this article. It's the New York Times. And they did an interview with technologists across Silicon Valley and asked them basically what their favorite novels were. It matters that many of us think, again, of such narrow frames, instead of people like Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, who ask different questions about our shared digital future. So for me, taking cues from these fiction writers who write from a different center is a great way to think beyond these 4 dominant approaches to global digital governance that I've talked about. It reminds us, first of all, that we have the power to imagine. And we have the power to imagine differently. Nothing is inevitable. Not AI, not digital technology, not climate change. If human agency built the shared digital reality that we live in today, then human agency can help us imagine a different, just, and shared, inclusive digital future. I'm always inspired by Ursula Le Guin's observation. She gave this in a speech at the National Book Awards. She said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." We imagined ourselves into this moment. We can always imagine ourselves into a different one. Second, and this is again why I love to think with fiction, is it shows us how different the world can look when we imagine with different centers. Books about the future with women and Africans and people of varied experiences of the future at the center force us to contend with the injustices of the present to avoid compounding them in the future. I make this point repeatedly when I think about social media and elections. Technology cannot fix problems if we do not face the problems. We can't fix things that people who have power don't want to fix. So I gained this lesson from thinking about digital technologies in Kenya, but I think it applies in many different contexts, including, for example, the way in which the European Union has explicitly carved out refugees from its protections against the human rights violations of AI. And my third point, reading fiction in this way, we are so much more connected than we imagine. You can read a book that's written by someone whose life is very different from yours, and imagine yourself within that world. Just because our centers are different doesn't mean that our experiences are so different that they cannot be reconciled. In fact, they must be. One of the tools you developed from reading books that imagines different people's experiences is understanding how choices made in one part of the world impact the other. For those of us developing ideas of global digital governance, this is such an important tool because it's about inviting us to think beyond the lines that we've drawn in our lives. So overall, I think I've given you a slight insight into how I think about these issues and how I hope other people will think about them too. Whenever a piece of legislation or policy or project lands on my desk, I usually start thinking about it from a literary perspective. What does this look like for the people who have the least power in the world this document imagines? Are we assuming that everybody has equal power to demand redress? Are we assuming that negative externalities like climate change or water scarcity are equally distributed around the world? What about the problems of plastic and electronic waste? Does this piece of legislation on producing a computer for every home in a specific community have any ideas about how to deal with the waste that comes from it? I'll be honest, it doesn't make you very popular. It makes you seem very negative in a world where so many people still want technology to be the answer to every question. But I think if we're not willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the world we are imagining, then we are not in a position to be building. When I read fiction in this way, when I read legislation in this way, I feel challenged to imagine broadly, led by empathy and an eye for how power shapes people's experiences of reality. This is heavy and uncomfortable work, but I think it's necessary work. And this is why I wanted to start this talk by making you uncomfortable. And I hope you're still a little bit uncomfortable. I like to imagine my role as a thinker in line with Edward Said's invitation for a public intellectual to be someone who raises uncomfortable questions, who resists orthodoxy and dogma, and who challenges those who have power to act in service of those who do not. We should all be accustomed to the uncomfortable world of imagining beyond the lines that we have drawn across our lives. Because imagining different futures is uncomfortable work that requires us to undo and let go of many of the assumptions we have about how the world works. There are Africans in the future. I take that as a reaffirmation that should make anyone who hasn't contemplated such a reality very uncomfortable. Asanteni sana. Thank you. Grazie.
Great speech. Thank you. So many words, but they were all necessary. So I don't know if we have time for one question, maybe. If there is any, just one, or yes.
It was really, really inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your words.
Oh,
I'm just elaborating.
okay.
So actually, I made an experiment while you were talking. I asked to ChatGPT to ask you a question.
Okay.
I just prompt as, can you make a question to an African woman journalist who is giving a speech on a real global digital future? And the question, I don't want to ask you this question, okay?
Got it.
Okay. So the question is, being an African woman journalist, you have a unique perspective on global issues. How do you see the role of digital platforms in amplifying underrepresented voices and promoting diverse narratives from Africa to the rest of the world? I don't want to ask you this question.
Got it.
So this is proving exactly what you said at the beginning, the perspective. So I just want you, if you have time, to give your thoughts about on the gender equality and also on the age,
Sure.
because these are other two, let's say, underrepresented
Groups.
yes, groups. And yeah, this one. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, first of all, I don't normally read speeches out. I usually just like talk, but I have a teammate in the booth, so we have to work together. You know, I think the most important thing is to keep coming back to the fact that people are just people. And I'm saying this because I'm doing a lot of work right now on using African feminism to think about global digital governance. And one of my favorite writers that I've read so far is Oyeronke Oyewumi, who's a Nigerian scholar. And she has this book about how Yoruba, Nigerian customs, it's a Nigerian culture, doesn't really have the idea of woman. In the sense that in Western philosophy, Western public life, woman is about attaching specific social qualities to a specific body. So a woman is what a man is not, because a woman is what a man is not, then every other aspect is defined in negative sense. So I'll give you an example. Women are so emotional. That is a loaded phrase that is not tied to, there's so many emotional men in the world. Look at Donald Trump. There are so many emotional men in the world. But it becomes this very essentialized quality, and it resides in the body because a woman is not a woman in this philosophical construct because she is smart and talented and capable and whatever. It's because it's tied to her body. So I'm not explaining it well, but the overall theory is that in cultures whereby, for example, there are no roles that are tied to gender. So there are many chieftaincies in West Africa and East Africa whereby women are chiefs and they are head of the households. You know, in my community, the idea of divorce is so normal, both men and women. If it's not working, you leave and you go and you take, there's this whole idea that it's not tied to the personhood. And so she's writing against that, and that's a timer. So I bring that to say that I think one of the things that needs to, and one of the reasons why I spent so much time talking about the Western philosophy versus the rest of the world and developmentalism is we take these things for granted at a global level because of the hegemonic position that Western philosophy occupies. But many of us live in cultural contexts in which these realities cannot be taken for granted. I speak African languages that are not gendered. If I want to say a woman teacher in Kiswahili, I have to say woman teacher. Teacher is not a gender, or let me use a gendered term. Sibling, you know, we say sibling. Ndugu is sibling. It's not female sibling or male sibling, it's ndugu. We say, you know, so there are many things that happen globally that are actually specific expressions of Western culture. And this is why opening up the room allows us to think about things differently. In Pakistan, the government just recognized the Hijra community. You can get a Hijra, the third gender, you can get that on your ID card. Not because of Western pressure and liberals and whatever, because Hijra have been part of Pakistani life forever. It is recognized. Pakistan is not a liberal society, right? So again, if we look at human beings, the Western philosophical tendency is to tie our interpretation of personhood to the body. There are many cultures where personhood is tied to the spirit and not to the physical presentation of that spirit. And I think thinking about people as people in a way that looks beyond the body, looks beyond gender, looks beyond age, looks beyond gender expression, looks beyond all of these things is a great way to start to include people in conversations, not because we need more Africans in the room, but because there are ideas out there that need to find expression in this conversation that we need to be able to include. I know that's a very convoluted answer, but I hope that I've gotten to an answer. But we can talk afterwards if not. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanjala.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you promise you will come back. I think we have to, I can say them, that she cannot stay too much in Torino, unfortunately. She will come back. But on Sunday, she will run the London Marathon, so we can give a big encouragement to her.
I have to tell you, because I'm Kenyan, when I tell people that I run, they have a very specific imagination. I'm not one of those Kenyans. I'm one of the slow ones. But thank you for the encouragement.